All right, I think we can go ahead and kick things off. Welcome, everybody. We've got some really great information to share with you today. So I will go ahead and start some introductions. Brad, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone is enjoying this beautiful late summer day and getting ready for the fall season ahead. So my name is Brad Gibbs. I'm the vice chair of the economics department at Brown, and I actually will give a more fulsome introduction as part of the presentation around Kellanova that I'll be discussing in a few minutes.
Great. And my name is Victoria Bray. I'm the Associate Director of Recruitment at the School of Professional Studies in the Division of Masters and Professional Programs. And I am here to answer any questions that you might have about applying to Brown's programs. I'll also share some details about Brown's Master's programs at the end of the session. So speaking of our agenda, we have a fantastic mini lecture planned for you that Brad has put together. We're going to talk a little bit about applying it to Brown, dates, deadlines, especially for our portfolio of business programs. And then we'd love to answer any of your questions, either about the mini lecture or Brown's programs. So with that being said, let's dive right into the mini lecture and I will hand things over to Brad.
Terrific. Thanks, Victoria. Great. Well, hopefully everyone can see my screen, and we're going to be talking about Kellanova, which is a really interesting case study in the context of thinking about strategic alternatives, a spin-off, and then M&A activity. So here's very briefly my agenda. I'll introduce myself, as I mentioned. I'm going to talk about snacking, which is what Kellanova is an expert in, and then I'll make some closing remarks, and we can provide some additional information about Brown's programs, as well as offer an opportunity for Q&A. So just to give you some context, I actually graduated from Brown a long time ago. I was a history concentrator. I took a year off to try to go to the Olympics. I failed miserably, but I learned a lot doing so. Came back to Brown pretty focused, and one of the things I was focused on was getting a job. I went into investment banking, spent several years at firms such as Salomon Brothers and UBS before getting an MBA at Wharton, focused on finance. I went back into investment banking, joining a firm called Lazard, and then spent 14 years at Morgan Stanley, largely doing mergers and acquisitions. After about 17 years doing mergers and acquisitions, I had an entrepreneurial itch which needed to be scratched, and I spent 3 years at a firm called Atlas Mara, for which I was the interim CFO for this London-listed company that was focused on buying and integrating banks across sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of my focus when it comes to my teaching, I try to bring a global orientation to the classes that I teach. I started in New York, but then spent 2 years in London, 3 years in Frankfurt, another 7 years in London, and then I ran Morgan Stanley in South Africa for 3 years before moving to Dubai, where I was spent 3 years in traveling back and forth to sub-Saharan Africa, acquiring banks in Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Mozambique, etc. I approach my teaching as a generalist, so I recognize that a lot of the course content in finance-related courses tends to be US-centric, largely because of the general size of the US capital markets. But given my background, I try to bring an international orientation. And the courses that I teach at Brown, now that I've been back 7 years, include investments and corporate finance and financial institutions at the undergraduate level. And then I've been teaching in our executive MBA program for the past 5 years. I teach a course called Financial Management, which really is a toolkit for how to be a chief financial officer. And I try to bring to bear as much in the way of practical application as I can. I find that my students really benefit from seeing where the rubber meets the road. So combining academic theory with how these tools are actually used out in the wild. So for the next 15 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, I'm going to talk about snacking. And I'm going to start with a map and this notion of an industrial cluster. And many of you are probably familiar with a whole host of industrial clusters. When one says industrial cluster, one will often think about Silicon Valley as an example, or the biotech corridor of Route 128, or one might think about Detroit. But there's a really interesting industrial cluster in a place called Battle Creek, Michigan. Battle Creek, Michigan happens to be the cereal capital of the world and is host to the two main global players, Kellogg's and Post. And it's just interesting. There's all sorts of interesting contextual history of how Battle Creek became the site of these two giants. Part of it has to do with the access to wheat and different grains, and also to a spa culture that developed in the early 20th century. Not going to go down that rabbit hole at the moment, but I do want to spend some time talking about Kellogg's. Kellogg's historically had been a pretty interesting company. You had the traditional cereal business, so these are all household names, and many of you on the call probably grew up with these brands in your kitchens. And of course, recognizable figures as a result of really extensive marketing campaigns like Tony the Tiger. In addition to the cereal business, Kellogg's also had an extensive snack portfolio. So all sorts of perhaps less than super healthy options like Pringles and Eggo waffles and Pop-Tarts contributed to this juggernaut in the space. Now, despite the fact that they put together a series of billion-plus-dollar brands, the share price performance of Kellogg's had been uneven over the past decade or so, effectively had gone sideways and had underperformed the S&P for an extended period of time. So this chart has the white line, which is the S&P 500. The blue line is Kellogg's, and you can see that for a few years up until late 2024, meaningful underperformance of Kellogg's versus the overall market as measured by this index known as the S&P 500. And so Kellogg sought to continuously transform its portfolio. So it had engaged in a host of mergers and acquisitions over the years, the acquisition of Pringles and RX bars, and then they also had some exits. So for example, they jettisoned the cookie business and sold the Keebler Elves. And so they reached a point where, despite all of these actions, they decided they needed to do a further strategic review of their portfolio. And so, after many months of study, they came up with the notion that they're going to spin off Kellogg's into three different businesses. They're going to have something called Global Snacking Co., which was going to be one company. They're going to have a North America cereal company, and then they were going to have a plant-based food company, which is referred to as Plant Co. Now, those plans continued to evolve, and they ended up only separating into two businesses, and they announced this spin-off. So what is a spin-off? A spin-off is the creation, as I've noted here from this Investopedia definition, it's the creation of an independent company which is basically created and the shares of which are distributed to the shareholders of the parent company. So why would someone do this? Why would you engage in a spin-off? Well, a couple reasons. One, there's a notion that you'll have better management. Your ability to attract talented C-suite executives will be enhanced to the extent that you can offer them control of a standalone operation as opposed to being a subsidiary within a larger conglomerate. There's a view that by separating out growth trajectories and strategies, you're going to be allocating resources more effectively. You're putting the right people in the right seats, and you're putting the right capital in the right places. Additionally, from an external perspective, if you have a company which is more focused, you may attract better coverage from Wall Street, that you may have the attention of true experts in one discipline or another, as opposed to an analyst who's trying to cover a conglomerate and may only have expertise in one of the silos, but one becomes something of an orphaned or neglected aspect of the business that may not be properly appreciated. And then the ultimate goal is to unlock shareholder value. So the ultimate goal of spinning off a business to your shareholders is to indeed try to explore and to bring to fruition the value that resides within that business that may not have been uncovered or realized within the broader portfolio. So what does it look like? Well, I have a little example here. On the left-hand side, you have a company. Before the spinoff, it has a set of shareholders that own a parent company. That parent company may have two subsidiaries, subsidiary A and subsidiary B. But then after the spinoff, subsidiary A remains within the portfolio parent company, but spinoff B is its own separately traded entity. So many of the companies that you probably know, the businesses that you may have frequented, are actually the result of spun off entities. So the limited is a good example. Back in the 80s and 90s, the limited had effectively gestated a whole host of retail brands. And then these brands were subsequently spun off to shareholders as separately listed securities. Names that you might know include Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie and Fitch, Bath and Body Works. Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie and Fitch spun off to shareholders of the larger limited entity. Another more recent spin-off is Topgolf and Callaway. So Callaway had acquired Topgolf and then not too long ago decided that it just wasn't a great fit. And as a result, if you were a shareholder of Topgolf Callaway, you would receive a share in this new separately listed Topgolf company, in addition to holding your share in Callaway, which is the golf club and ball company. And why did they do this? Well, in the context of Topgolf Callaway, it was all the reasons I mentioned: enhanced strategic focus, an optimized capital allocation, simplify the structure, and then different trajectories, different investment theses, perhaps attracting different investors. Here's an overview of the business, and interestingly, it's happening right now. So by the end of this year, these businesses will be separated. So whenever you undertake a spinoff, you have to answer a whole host of questions, and it becomes kind of a really interesting corporate finance exercise, as well as just an internal management exercise. So how do you communicate this to your stakeholders? And think about all the stakeholders of a company like Kellogg's or Topgolf Callaway. You have customers, you have suppliers, you obviously have your employees, you have the communities in which these businesses operate. Everyone is going to wonder what's going to happen as a result of this seemingly dramatic transformation of the corporate form. Then there's really the question of who goes where. What employees go to which entity? Where does management go? How do you establish the board of these separate companies? And then there's the question of intellectual capital. How do you determine who gets what brands, what IP within one entity or the other? And then what about shared services? So for example, Kellogg's probably has centralized tax and accounting. How are you going to then allocate tax and accounting services across the two different Kellogg's entities? How do you think about the co-location of different sites around the globe? Lots and lots of meetings, lots and lots of decisions. And then ultimately, you need to be really, really confident that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. That indeed, by undertaking this transaction, you are unlocking value. Then there's some blocking and tackling questions for your investors. How do you think about dividend policy? How do you think about the balance sheet? How much debt should one entity get versus another entity? How do you think about borrowing? How do you think about corporate credit rating, et cetera, et cetera? So really interesting exercise. So when Kellogg's undertook this spinoff, they focused on all of the same notions that I had mentioned earlier: sharper management focused, increased agility, optimal capital allocation, distinctive culture of the entities, et cetera. And thus they created Kellanova. Kellanova is the snacking arm of Kellogg's. So Kellanova was going to include household names like Pringles and Cheez-Its and Pop-Tarts and Rice Krispie treats. And that would be a higher growth business than the traditional cereal business, which in the world in which we live today is effectively X growth. You just don't see the same number of people pulling Frosted Flakes off the shelves that you might have 20 to 30 years ago. So Kellanova was introduced to be the world's best performing snacks-led powerhouse. And they put together a very compelling presentation in order to convince Kellogg shareholders that this was in their best interests and that they would be the recipient of a Kellanova share for the previous Kellogg's share that they owned, and that there was a thesis and a rationale for them holding on to that share, that shareholder value would be created. So a whole host of slides as part of their IR efforts that announced the birth of this company, and ultimately explaining to their constituents this was a compelling investment opportunity. And surely as an employee of Kellanova, you would hopefully buy into the vision of the exciting path ahead. So now I just want to pivot, and I want to talk about the consolidation we've seen in the consumer products industry writ large. This chart's a little old. There's been further M&A activity since this was created. But what's really interesting about consumer products is just the velocity of acquisition activity that's taken place over the past 20, 30 years. And so you basically have 5 or 6 companies that control a significant proportion of the highest selling brands in the marketplace. And so why is this consolidation taking place? What is driving this activity? So we should talk a little bit about, well, what is the rationale for M&A? Well, the traditional thesis is that you buy and integrate entities in order to achieve economies of scale, economies of scope, maybe to increase your valuation, maybe because of low interest rates and your ability to borrow. Maybe there are certain sectors which are trading at really, really low values that offer an opportunity or an arbitrage. Maybe you're thinking about capital structure, underutilized balance sheet capacity by which you can acquire and tuck in transactions. And maybe there's some changes to a regulatory landscape. So the FTC today looks a lot different than it did 3 years ago. So a myriad of factors drive M&A activity. And one that I would mention when it comes to consumer products is that you have economies of scale and scope on the one hand amongst the consumer products companies, but what they're really addressing is the fact that you've had massive consolidation of their customers. So when you think about the landscape of who is buying Pop-Tarts and Frosted Flakes, well, there may be us, the end users, but really it's the Walmarts and the Krogers of the world. And so to the extent that Walmart has become the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to the retail shopping experience in the consumer basket, then in order to counter all of the economies of scale and scope that Walmart has, all of these consumer products companies have sought to match heft with heft. So what's interesting when it comes to Kellanova is that shortly after Kellanova was launched as this separate spun-off entity, it actually was acquired. So almost out of nowhere, Mars, which many of you probably know is the confectionery company, but actually the larger proportion of its business is in the pet space, pet food, as well as veterinary care, swooped in and made a $36 billion deal to buy Kellanova. And in connection with its transaction, the rationale was that that snacking would be better together. You're going to combine the chocolate business of Mars with the crunchy snack business of Kellanova. And you can imagine the purchasing power, but more importantly, the distribution power that the combined Mars Kellanova would have when negotiating with grocery stores, Walmart, other retailers when it comes to getting brands that drive customer traffic on the shelves. Here's some additional perspective and collateral around the stated vision. And what's amazing is now with the Mars Kellanova combination, you have $17 billion brands residing within the same corporate shell. Pretty extraordinary. $35.9 billion. This was an all-cash deal, and it represented a 44% premium to Kellanova's share price the day before this transaction was announced. So Mars, in order to compel these newly minted Kellanova shareholders to give up their shares, they offered them a significant premium to the then trading value. Now, not everyone thought this was a great deal. Here's some press articles from the FT, the Financial Times, saying that this was going to be perhaps an indigestible acquisition. All sorts of food-related analogies were printed left and right. But it's interesting now that the deal is closed, we'll have to see what happens. Now, Mars is a privately held company, so we're never going to know for sure, but we will no doubt hear one way or another whether or not this has been a successful deal or not. So then the question is, now what? Well, what happens to the remaining cereal business? I mentioned that when Kellanova undertook the spinoff, you had the exciting snacking company created, which is Kellanova. What happens to that bread and butter flakes business? The next question is, how do competitors respond? What happens in the consumer product space in reaction to this dramatic transaction? Well, fortunately, I have the answer. Interestingly, Ferrero swooped in to buy WK Kellogg. That's the name of the remaining cereal business, and that's a $3.1 billion deal. And interestingly, Ferrero, which many of you might know is the producer of Nutella, now is going to own Frosted Flakes, Fruit Loops, Rice Krispies. So double doubling down in the breakfast space, and also trying to find the synergy between effectively confections and grains. And then interestingly, just this morning, Kraft Heinz actually announced a plan to separate. So not unlike Kellogg's, Kraft Heinz has been undergoing a strategic analysis of its portfolio and ultimately has decided, for purposes of unlocking shareholder value, to separate into what they're calling Global Taste Elevation Co., which is going to be the Heinz brand plus Philadelphia and Kraft mac and cheese. And that's going to be separate from North American Grocery Co., which is the legacy Kraft business, Oscar Mayer Wieners, Kraft Singles, and Lunchables. So it's really interesting how one transaction will beget another transaction, how one transaction will accelerate M&A, will accelerate the desire to explore, in the words of Schumpeter, notions of creative destruction, continually destroying, continually renewing perspectives on business models. So a couple closing comments. Corporate forms aren't static, and the public equity markets ensure this. People can vote with their feet and vote with their pocketbook in terms of the buying and selling of shares and determining where they think value is going to be realized. The corporate finance toolkit is extensive. Spinoffs are amongst the topics that I cover in financial management in the executive MBA course. And what's really important to understand is that investment strategy and financial strategy are closely linked. Additionally, I think it's interesting that the market for corporate control is efficient. There was no buyer of the entirety of the historical Kellogg business. But once they'd separated it into these two distinct parts, then that led to the interest of Mars on the one hand and Ferrero Rocher on the other. And additionally, I only touched on this on the slide, but didn't mention it verbally, the private equity industry, LBOs, ensure the efficiency of the market for corporate control because there's literally trillions of dollars of dry powder on the sidelines that's ready to be put to work anytime there's a corporate orphan asset that looks to be undervalued. And so while finance, as I note here, shouldn't be the tail that wags the dog, I think that financial fluency is absolutely critical to stakeholder value creation and a really important part of any developing professionals' toolkit as they continue to ascend the corporate ladder, or for an entrepreneur who's looking to build a business, et cetera, et cetera. So all sorts of interesting applications, I think, beyond simply just investment banking. I think that, once again, financial fluency, really important arrow in the quiver. So why don't I pause there? I'll turn it back to Victoria, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brad. So I just have some information after the lecture that I wanted to share about our master's in business portfolio of programs. So we have a couple of programs I wanted to talk about. If you want to have participate in lectures like this and intellectually stimulating conversation across the portfolio of programs, we have a couple to choose from. So the online masters in management, the online masters in organizational leadership, both fully online programs. Coming soon, we'll have another online program, which is a master's is business analytics. And then we have an executive master's in business administration that we partner with IE Business School on. So that's the suite of business programs that we offer through Brown School of Professional Studies. Some application information depending on which program you're interested in. So the online master's in management, across all of our programs, you need a degree, a bachelor's degree from an accredited institution. You'll need transcripts, a resume. For the master's in management, you can have 0 to 5 years of professional experience. So if you're a recent graduate or recently out of college, then this is a great fit program for you. We require 3 letters of recommendation. That's across all of the master's programs at Brown University. We'll have you write a personal statement, submit an application fee of $100. And then for international applicants, we have some additional requirements for you to submit if you do not speak English as your native language and don't have a degree from an institution where English is the sole language of instruction. Similar requirements for our online masters in organizational leadership. One of the main differences here that I want to highlight is that we are going to require at least 3 years of professional experience. So that's different from the previous program that we were just talking about, where you can have 0 to 5 years of experience. We're going to need at least 3 years for you to be a successful applicant to this program. But similarly, like I said, 3 letters of recommendation, a personal statement, transcripts, application fee, and then those English language proficiency scores for folks who need to submit them. Some upcoming deadlines for the 2 online programs. Like I said, the master's in business analytics hasn't launched yet, but it will soon. But for the other 2 that we talked about, you can see these upcoming deadlines. Really pay attention to those final deadlines. We'll need all of your applications submitted by that point. And then the semester start dates as well, because of the online piece. We have several intakes per year. And then finally, I want to talk about the IE Brown Executive MBA program. We have a couple dates on here for spring 2026 start, the next priority deadline being November 3rd, which doesn't feel like it's right around the corner, but it certainly is. Similarly, for this portfolio of programs, we're going to require a couple of items, a resume or CV, essay questions. We're going to need your official university transcripts for this program, a bachelor's degree, just like for the other ones. This one, we require 2 letters of recommendation and then the application fee. An important note here, you need at least 10 years of experience in order to qualify for our IE Brown Executive MBA program. So that being said, I think it's time for us to start taking some questions. We'll go into the Q&A and start to answer those. In the meantime, I'll pull up some of our contact information for folks who want more information from us. I'll also add my email address to the chat so that you can stay in contact with us throughout the application process. So let's pull up that Q&A. And Brad, the first question is for you. Why was one of the companies that Kellogg spun off of solely focused on the United States and the Caribbean? Does this area of the world eat more cereal than others?
Great question. In fact, it does. So the North American cereal business is the vast majority of Kellogg's cereal business. But I think the reason that they decided to have Kellanova hold on to the international cereal piece was simply as a result of the complexity of that separation that I mentioned. So easier to draw a perimeter around the North American business and as opposed to trying to carve out in each country in which cereal was sold a separate subsidiary that would have resided within North America Cereal Co. But great question, and certainly one of the structuring complexities I imagine the companies and advisors faced.
Awesome. Any other questions folks have either about the programs that we talked about or the lecture that we had?
Well, maybe I'll just make a quick comment, which was that obviously I went through that quite quickly, but particularly I'll apply this in teaching in the Master's in Management program, in addition to my core financial management course in the Executive MBA, is a case study based approach. So I do think that there is real utility, as I had said earlier, in the marrying of theory and application. So if you like experiential type learning, then this is the type of program for you.
So we got another question. How is Kellanova responding to changing food dye regulations globally?
Great question. And I think this is going to be a challenge for Mars. And you have already probably seen some articles about the intense lobbying related to use of food dye in M&Ms. So I think the snacking industry, and I'm not necessarily an expert in it, although I do like a crispy potato chip, is certainly undergoing some transformation, because we also have to think about the impact of weight loss drugs like Ozempic. And so, what are these doing to the sector as well, and how has that potentially changed the anticipated trajectory of Kellanova when Mars was evaluating the acquisition versus what we're seeing today? So I
Interesting.
imagine a whole host of scenario and sensitivity planning.
So I also have a question on my end. Can we submit more than 3 letters of recommendation? And the answer is no. The maximum number of letters of recommendation you can submit is 3. So we definitely encourage you to choose 3 folks who can speak to you really specifically and really positively. I get a lot of questions from folks like, who should I ask for a letter of recommendation from? And it really depends on you as an individual. If you're asking somebody for an academic letter of recommendation, they should be able to speak more to you than just this person did really well in my class. They should be able to speak to your membership of a classroom community, how you participate in groups and individually, and also how successful you'll be in a graduate level program at Brown. So that's sort of how I would approach letters of recommendation. Any other questions from folks? I think we've answered everything so far. Here's one. Would you be able to say more about why Warren Buffett said Kraft Heinz split won't fix problems despite the management push?
Sorry, Victoria, I had a connection issue. Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, no worries. Would you be able to say more about why Warren Buffett said the Kraft Heinz split won't fix the problems despite management push?
Yeah, I haven't read. I Buffett has talked in the past that this was not his finest hour, with respect to this combination. That unfortunately, the synergies that they expected to be realized from the combination didn't come to fruition, and against the backdrop of some real pressures in with respect to growth in the end markets, and that these products has led to some concerns that this is simply a rearranging of deck chairs on the Titanic. I don't think we're talking about the Titanic. People are always going to be buying the products that Kraft Heinz sells and the individual, now 2 entities, sell. But the growth dynamics of particularly the 70s, 80s, and 90s, those are gone, and they're just never coming back.
All right. Well, that's it for questions. Brad, thank you so much for taking my time. It was a really excellent lecture. If folks have any questions, I dropped my email address in the chat, so you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly, and I can connect you with any resources at Brown that you might be interested in learning more about. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.